Every college student is different, but Jason has always been, he's always been strong-willed. He's always been courageous. He just would always strike out on an adventure. He would do anything. He was always incredibly optimistic. He always figured everything would be okay in the end. Lisa and I have been married 31 years. We have 3 kids. Jason's our youngest. My wife's a musician. I can't carry a tune in a bucket, but he's always wanted to play any instrument. He's always loved it. Growing up in a church family isn't a normal family. Being a preacher's kid is difficult. I think there's just this pressure to be perfect. Going to church is not really optional when you're a preacher's kid, and that's unusual in this day and age. This was his first semester at Texas State. Finals were just wrapping up, and he was coming back for Christmas. So, you know, kind of looking forward to the week and all the different things you've got going on in life.
My name is Jack Frank. I've known Jason Landry since childhood, and he was also my next-door neighbor here in college. Jason's game plan was to go home and then just be home for winter break. He said, I'm gonna hit the road back home, and I sent him a text asking him to get some sleep before he hit the road, and he sent me a text saying that I'm all good, I appreciate you looking out, and that was the last I got to hear from him.
My name is Jeff Ferry. I'm a captain of the Criminal Investigations Division of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office. December 13th, 2020 was a Sunday night. A volunteer firefighter is driving down Salt Flat Road, which is this county road in Luling, and he encounters a vehicle with its driver's side against a tree line, a fence line.
Got some driver's side damage.
Headlights are on, sees that it's unoccupied.
Apparently, the driver was able to kick out the window in the back.
The volunteer calls the Caldwell County Dispatch. In our county, Texas Highway Patrol works all motor vehicle collisions. And so a Texas Highway Patrol trooper ends up responding about an hour later. He kind of drove up and down the road looking for the driver of this vehicle, making sure there's nobody who's hurt, and maybe he wandered off from the car and now he's laying in a ditch and he needs medical aid. We have to find him, especially because temperatures are dropping. It's cold. We've got a pretty significant weather event blowing in that night. But he doesn't find anybody. So Highway Patrol shows up at that accident scene.
There's where his shorts and underwear are.
He does encounter some clothes, which is very unusual. The clothes are about 900 feet to the south, going towards Luling from the collision scene.
He's completely naked wherever he's at.
Those articles of clothes are strewn about the roadway in sequence consistent with voluntarily disrobing. Then he finds the backpack.
Oh, there's a wallet.
At this point, our deputy arrives at the vehicle collision scene.
White male, probably a college kid. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Make a note, approximately 10 marijuana blunts located inside a prescription bottle.
Certainly the narcotics, we think, played a factor. There was no indication there had been a loss of life as a result of that collision. All the evidence was that this was an intoxicated person, college kid out of Texas State, goofing off and had a collision. Why does he take his clothes off? I don't know.
Last name Landry, first name Jason.
And our trooper radios the driver's license number in, then ends up calling Mr. Landry and Mrs. Landry, who are the registered owners of the vehicle that's left abandoned.
Hello?
Mrs. Landry?
Yeah?
My name is Trooper Flores with the Texas Highway Patrol.
Okay.
The reason I'm calling is I'm currently at a crash scene involving a 2003 Nissan Altima golden color.
Okay.
I suspect Jason may have been driving this vehicle.
Oh my gosh, okay.
To get a 2 a.m. phone call and be a highway patrolman on the other end of the line is just, well, you just can't imagine it. That changes your life forever.
How bad was the car?
He crashed into some trees and a private fence.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Have you been in contact with him this evening?
I have not.
Are you able to find his phone?
No.
So, should I head? What should we do?
Well,
Then pray.
Yeah, we're in Houston.
no, I understand. I'll be back in touch with you momentarily, okay?
I wouldn't say they were nonchalant, but they found his wrecked car and they were looking for him. And really kind of that was about it. I don't know how long I waited before I left, but it wasn't too long. Then I hit the road. I'm driving to Luling from Houston, and I was just gonna help search and do whatever it needed to be to find my son. You know, frankly, I was driving along thinking at any minute, I'm gonna see Jason just walking along the road, and I get to choke him and hug him at the same time. But there's nothing on this dark highway. You know, I'm almost to Luling, and I figure there are people searching. I figure there are sirens, there's cops walking around with spotlights on. There's nothing out there. My wife, Lisa, calls me and says, they towed the car. I'm like, can you call the highway patrolman and get the exact location? She called the highway patrolman and she woke him up because he had gone home and gone to bed. So she gave me the exact location off of Salt Flat Road. When I found the accident site,
These are the track marks, and you can go down here and you can see where the car went off. You can see the wheels and hit down here by this tree and fence.
and that's when I found his clothes.
See, those are 2 pairs of socks, shorts.
Mr. Landry sees socks, and they're kind of goofy socks, and he knows immediately, those are my sons.
I mean, I was a lawyer. I'm not stupid. I know what evidence could be, but they don't work the scene. That's my personal opinion. They don't do what everyone has seen that they do at an accident site. You know, put the tape up, measure the tire tracks, pick up the evidence that literally is laying in front of you. But I don't know why they don't pick up his clothes.
I'm about 20 feet ahead. This is his flip-flops. And this is his t-shirt.
Thankfully, Mr. Landry documents that prior to picking him up. He takes video of all that.
This is his toiletry bag. And the car ran off the road right around this curve. So this is, you know, maybe a football field, maybe a little bit more, where I found his clothes lying in the road.
This still pisses me off, to be honest. It's your job to do the most basic thing. But from the very beginning, highway patrolman thought this was nothing other than a one-car accident with some college student who smoked pot, and he's just wandering around out in the woods. Well, if you believe that that's true in 30-degree weather with 20-knot winds, and literally there's a full set of clothes lying on the road, you at least go find the lost person, wrap a blanket around them, give them some hot soup, and then sort out the details as to what happened. But I was the only one looking for Jason. I had to find my phone for Jason so I could see that his phone was at the tow lot where the highway patrolman said the car was towed.
What the heck happened back here?
When I found his wrecked car, it's just kind of chaos in a sense of your emotions.
God, please be with him.
I knew his phone was in there. It had slid down kind of between the seat and the armrest. I had to go from the back seat kind of behind it, and I was able to get it. Not that I can unlock it, it's just I had his phone.
There's no evidence of where Jason is, and so there's nobody looking for Jason. And so Mr. Landry does what anybody does, calls the police and says, hey, what's going on? Texas Highway Patrol then realizes, hey, we should get a search team together.
On December 14th, they bring in Texas Search and Rescue, aka Texar, and they're a nonprofit that comes in for smaller communities who don't just have the resources to dedicate to large searches like this. And they search several acres of land. Usually they do by ground, they do it by horse, they also do aerial searches as well.
Texas Search and Rescue were out there searching around the crash site for him. Right near where the car was wrecked, there's a hillside, and on the other side of the hill is a retention pond that's maybe a half-acre big. And all the search dogs keep hitting that he went into that pond.
They brought in some swiftwater rescue guys, some dive teams to search this pond. They brought out sonar imaging to image the pond.
They get permission from this owner to actually drain the entire pond. You can hear the pumps running 24 hours a day. And every moment for the first week, I keep expecting the director from Texas Search and Rescue to tell us that they found our son. Words can't describe that living hell. Just waiting for the axe to fall, thinking any moment you're going to hear that they found your child. And all I can visualize is him floating there in that dirty water. And you don't want him to be there. And then finally, when they drain the pond, he's not there. You're thankful, but where is he? Are we looking in the right places and just haven't found him? Or are we not looking in the right places because he was never there? Or is he lying in some shallow grave somewhere around Luling and we just haven't found him because someone put him there? That's all you can think about. As a dad, your primary responsibility is just to protect your kids. And I failed.
Hello, my name is Jason Landry.
I saw Jason every single day the week prior to his disappearance.
So I just got out of the shower and, I was thinking, about things as I do.
That Monday started off completely normal. Like he was the person I'd known him to be and was just doing his day-to-day routine. He spent a lot of time in his bedroom, especially just with online school. Our campus life was just looking at a monitor that semester. Our social life was pretty lackluster. I started noticing Jason was relying a lot more on smoking, and the more he ended up smoking, the more off rails his thought process started going.
The weed's good in the sense that it gives you great ideas and everything, but it's hard to focus as well.
I'm not naive. I went through college too. And to tell me if I am surprised that a 21-year-old in college smokes pot, no, I am not surprised.
I met Jason Landry in 7th grade, and then as the years went by, I got to know him a lot more. When I got to Texas State, I was moving in, and Jason pulls up in the house right next door to me. He was very happy to see someone he knew as well, and seeing him next door gave me a lot more hope for the semester.
Jason was so excited to go to Texas State.
Bro.
What?
I got accepted.
You did? That's amazing. You happy?
Duh.
Of course, COVID hit, and all the fun going out and meeting people were just taken away from him. For some people, if you're really introverted, that's a good thing. But for an extrovert, that's just the worst thing in the world to lock yourself into a room and not be able to actually connect with people. I think that really negatively impacted Jason.
I'm tired. I want to go to bed.
I think Jason struggled with the life online. He was really just in his own shell.
What I would always do is, think about all the things I have to do and get overwhelmed by it.
For Jason, he was still, I think, very much in that midst of trying to sort things out and trying to decide what he wanted for his life.
I knew that Jason, over the days up until that point, hadn't been sleeping and eating properly and had only been smoking. That's when I started having concerns for him. But Jason was still completely coherent and cognitive. The night he left, that was the last time I texted Jason.
So Saturday after Jason's disappearance, the search continued with Texar. Helicopters went up, fixed-wing aircraft has gone out, canine teams have gone out, drone assets were deployed, and we used hundreds of thousands of drone images that were taken. That first week was pretty intense.
We're seeing the helicopters fly in and the dog teams. I can't even begin to imagine how many dog teams have searched for Jason. Seems like every dog in half the United States has been searching for Jason. I'm like, why haven't we found him or any trace of him? Have we been searching in the right place?
After Saturday, we said, hey, if we have not found anything by now, let's cease search operations until we have evidence of one thing or another. We hadn't even built a timeline by that point. So we requested Texar to cease all search operations. And then we started doing the forensics on the car. Our detectives processed that vehicle. They went through every piece of evidence. We collected DNA swabs. We fingerprinted the outside of the car to see if there had been any other potentially viable latent prints that we could retrieve and process. We became very aggressive in our investigation and started looking for video from anybody or anything that was in the area. We're pulling game cameras. We're reaching out to property owners and seeing if they have hidden cameras on their property. We're looking for video from convenience stores. Maybe something happened on the drive from the apartment in San Marcos to the area of the crash. Maybe something happened on the road in between the two, but we were really left with nothing on the video side. We did rely on traditional police work, and we also relied heavily on Jason's digital data. We knew early on one of the key things we wanted was Waze, which has his geolocation data. He was driving through Luling, and it certainly appears that during that travel, he's using Waze for directions.
When you're using apps like Waze, they like pinging you like every time you pass a tower, and so they can see minute by minute where you are. And the thing about using technology is that you can also see when they close it out. And I think that's really been a game changer for investigators.
It appears that he minimizes Waze and opens up Snapchat. He's looking at a story on his phone, and he misses his turn. He should turn right. He proceeds straight. Looking at all the evidence we've collected, we can document every second of Jason's travel from his apartment in San Marcos, the entire route into Luling, where we believe he misses his turn. We have every second accounted for. And then Jason has a single vehicle collision, but we don't know why. What contributed to that collision? Could a deer or a hog or something jumped out in the road and he overcorrected? Could have. Could it have been Jason dropped his phone? If he's digging around for his phone, overcorrected, had a single vehicle collision, and then left the vehicle on his own. certainly feels like that's the most plausible. It really is two separate questions, though. You know, what happened to Jason? Where is Jason? This is America, and you're allowed to disappear. If you want to start another life, you can do that. That's not something we've encountered, but it is a possibility. So is this an involuntary missing? Is this a voluntary missing? Fast forward a couple months, now there's these creation of these Facebook groups. Now the media is heavily involved.
A missing person billboard can now be found along Highway 183 going from Luling to Lockhart in hopes of bringing home missing Texas State student Jason Landry.
I've been covering this since December of 2020 when we learned that Jason had gone missing. And this case seemed to resonate with the community more than any other case that I've seen. People see something like this happen and they're like, oh my gosh, that could literally be my kid.
You can't imagine you're waiting for a phone call, but you dread a phone call. And then you wonder, how long are you going to be waiting? And it just, every day is another day.
It's likely that Jason wanders into the woods. I do believe firmly that we just haven't found him. We know that the area where Jason goes missing has a lot of wild hogs. And these are 200-300-pound critters.
We know that there is a wild hog problem in Central Texas. Wild hogs can destroy thousands of dollars of crops and property. And so if Jason was somewhere in the woods unconscious, I think there's a possibility that wildlife could have gotten to his body.
When there's a scarcity of food, hogs will not miss a meal, especially in December, January, February. Is it possible that that's why we've not been able to find a body? Maybe. It's possible he's gone.
In my opinion, Caldwell County Sheriff's Office don't seem to want to think about a possibility that it's anything other than a one-car accident and that Jason wandered off in the field and got eaten by feral hogs, period. There's nothing to be done in their mind because, you know, there's nothing left of Jason. Too bad, so sad. But maybe it's not a single car accident. Let's broaden the scope. Let's use all the tools that are available.
My name is Abel Pena, retired from the FBI after 26 and a half years. I've worked a number of missing persons cases while employed with the FBI. My daughter attends Texas State, and she called me about a friend of hers that was missing. It hit close to home. Jason was characterized by my daughter as just a very pleasant, very happy-go-lucky, free spirit, but a very warm and loving person. My daughter used to date his best friend, and so there was this closeness that they had.
Jason was just one of those people that was kind of I think a glue person that keeps a group of people together. He was one that had a lot of good friends and impacted a lot of lives. And it was a friend of his who told her dad, hey, Dad, have you heard about this one? And he contacted us and said, hey, I think I might be able to help you.
We're part of Project Absentis, which is a nonprofit. We got a team of retired FBI agents, Border Patrol. We've got some other intel folks. So we're there to kind of provide that bridge between the family of the missing and be there for assistance to local or state authorities. We offered our services free of charge to the Landry family.
To have someone else besides Caldwell County Sheriff's Office looking at it makes us happy. Put a different set of eyes on this. Maybe they can look at the same facts and get a different conclusion.
I reached out to the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, and it can be a little bit of a balancing act. You don't want to appear like you're trying to take over. What we wanted to do was work together, trying to locate Jason.
We felt comfortable sharing information because we were all working towards the same goal, finding Jason, getting answers.
When we first started this investigation, we want to look at the victim. From that picture, you can determine his habits, his behavior. The sheriff's department believed that Jason was so high, he crashed that vehicle. But most college kids, they smoke marijuana, they get high. And so, by all accounts, Jason was a normal college kid experimenting with marijuana. As an investigator, you want to make sure you allow other possibilities. Initially, I felt a bit critical about the way it was handled. The red flag for many of us would have been the clothes. Just to see the clothes laid out the way they were along the road. The whole area was trampled on, tampered with, and the vehicle was towed immediately. If there was any evidence left behind, it was destroyed. We also had a lot of questions as to why Jason drove down Salt Flat Road. Why did he miss that turn? Was he distracted? Was he lost? Did somebody guide him down that road? We started going door to door along Salt Flat Road and also along Austin Magnolia at the intersection. So we started talking to people. And while it didn't really get us too much, it still gave us an understanding of the area and of some of the neighbors, some of the people in the town. We start learning that there is a drug problem out there, a major drug problem. Drugs just are wreaking havoc on Luling. So we learned that there is some bad people.
Recently, we've had an uptick in violent crime, a lot more violent encounters, a lot more murder cases. Certainly it's been more violent than it has been any other time in my 19-year career. But you're gonna have bad people all over the country.
As we continued knocking on doors, a lot of people in Luling were very forthcoming with us.
We continue to follow the disappearance of Texas State student Jason Landry.
Jason Landry disappeared in December of 2020 on his way back from his college in San Marcos to his home near Houston for Christmas break. Law enforcement say his car was found crashed in Luling with Jason nowhere to be found.
And I don't think he walked away from his life just like that. And so somebody knows something, and we think it's local.
Many, however, were reluctant. They would say they know things, but were just too afraid to talk because of drug dealers nearby. We felt it was beneficial to set up a tip line to receive incoming calls from people that felt uncomfortable calling the police. I mean, they're deathly scared of what could happen if these people learned that they were involved in telling us who was involved. We didn't feel that the tip line was going to receive a lot of calls, but we did. And the consistency of calls about what happened to Jason that night was too overwhelming to ignore. The information we're receiving is that something nefarious happened to him.
Jason Landry was last seen December 13th, 2020. If you have any information, please contact the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office at 512-398-6777.
Any tip we received, we vetted out. There was a sighting of Jason near Dallas. We traveled up there and knocked on the door, and we met with the person that they believed was Jason. It wasn't obviously Jason. We sent people out to Austin because there were sightings at some of the homeless camps, a sighting here in San Antonio. We checked that out. We traveled and we vetted a lot of these leads in the hope that Jason was out there. And so we continued pressing forward, talking to more and more people from our anonymous tip line. The information we're receiving is that Jason encountered individuals at that intersection of Magnolia and Austin Street, and something happened to him. We're not sure what at this point, but something we believe nefarious happened to him. And we were told he may not have been driving the vehicle. From that intersection to where the vehicle was found down South Flat Road, roughly 4 miles away, somebody may have driven that vehicle and crashed that vehicle purposely.
Those are 2 pairs of socks, shorts.
And then thrown his clothes around to make it look like something happened there, which steered the investigation at the onset.
I can see where he went sideways.
The crazy thing about this case is it's all reduced down to 1 hour. What happened between 11:30 and 12:30 between that point in Luling and Salt Flat Road? What happened in 1 hour over about a 3-mile stretch of road?
I want to be careful what I say here. We received several names from these anonymous calls of the people that would say they were involved or may have knowledge of Jason's disappearance. They said Jason was accosted by individuals at that location, but they're saying that even if these guys are arrested, they're worried about the families and just the repercussions that result in them being considered snitches.
Luling is a small rural community where folks have been for generations. And when it comes to talking with the cops, I think there's always a fear when some kind of case is being investigated.
I received a letter at my home address. It was a bit creepy receiving a letter that I had no clue who it was from, but it described in fairly good detail everything we've been hearing on our anonymous tip line. If they were making this up, I do not believe they would go through the effort to find my home address. They wanted to make sure that that information got specifically to me, and it was received.
We are familiar with the information that the private investigators were able to collect, and we're familiar with some of their beliefs. But people have different motivations for sharing information. People say things because there's no consequences, right? Well, then you hear that, and then you tell somebody, and then it's that classic telephone game, right? All of which makes investigations difficult.
Some crazy person sent me an email saying that Jason was disposed of by a wood chipper, like in the movie Fargo. And to think that they would send that to me, then you visualize that happening to your child. And I pray that that's not true.
We try to make the story make sense with the information we have. I mean, I guess if I'm a 21-year-old coming from a college town, which is full of narcotics, I guess it's possible you could stop in Luling, Texas at 11:30 at night and randomly encounter convicts on the corner, and that they would force your vehicle off the road or kill you and then stage the single vehicle collision, which we don't believe happened. But that's what was getting said, and that's what the PIs kept hearing. And so by God, it's gotta be true, because people keep telling us. Well, it's my opinion, the only way the private investigators' theories can flesh out is if you discount all of the hard evidence, and that's really when we stopped having a relationship with the private investigator.
If you believe that Jason just walked off and disappeared, in my opinion, there's not going to be much effort in trying to look at this case as anything other than a missing persons case. And it's important as an investigator to explore really all options. And that's to look at the possibility that something criminal could have happened to Jason. So they're treating this as a missing persons case, but there was DNA samples taken, as well as fingerprints from Jason's car. You can process the prints, you can try to run it through the system and see if it matches with any known prints.
I've tried enough cases in criminal court and civil court to know that there's so many databases and stuff that you can search for. If you have the DNA material, you can search for a hit.
That DNA evidence is not really evidence of anything. I mean, it's evidence that somebody else was in the car. Well, how many people have ever been in your car? We have to have evidence of a crime. And if we thought for a second that DNA evidence would get us any closer to what happened to Jason Landry, wholeheartedly and assuredly, we would do that. But, you know, that gets to a point where we don't have anything else to update. So that's frustrating. We don't ever hang it up, right? We just continue to trudge on. We continue to work.
I just want them to do their job and find answers.
Since Jason's disappearance 6 months ago, the Landry family has become no stranger to the city of Luling.
When we come here, it's what that makes me think of is it's so hard every time we leave again without him.
And they say they'll keep coming until they find out what happened to their son.
Just help us find him. We just want to find him.
If someone hurt Jason or did something to Jason, then they better be brought to justice.
And first tonight, a prayer vigil in Missouri City for 21-year-old Jason Landry. The student at Texas State has now been missing for 1 year.
Fox 26's Matthew Seedorf is live outside Southminster Presbyterian Church tonight, where a vigil for Jason just wrapped up. Matthew.
An emotional night for family and friends here.
There's one here at the church, and the one in Luling was set up by some of the locals there.
My family did attend the candlelight ceremony. I wasn't able to make it myself because of my work schedule, which I do think about a lot. I feel like that was a very important thing to be present for. Jason was always known for wearing his silly socks, and so I was texting his mom, and I was just saying I'm wearing my silly socks sitting here thinking about y'all.
It's amazing how many people turned out for both of those. And to be honest, I wasn't in either one. I stayed out all night by where the accident was. Just by myself and Jason. And there's no good reason why, I just needed to. It's the same reason why you go put flowers on a loved one's grave on their birthday or on the anniversary of their death. You need to be there in that space.
At the 1 year mark, we're still actively investigating. We're still looking for information. And we remain available to the Landrys if they have questions, but I think our relationship is strained.
The Attorney General's office opened up a cold case unit at the end of 2021. They just took the Landry case on in December, I believe. For the Landry family means that there is going to be a fresh set of eyes and a fresh set of investigators taking on Jason's case, looking at all of the evidence, maybe looking at something that the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office missed or the private investigator might have missed. And hopefully we find an answer that wasn't there before and can give the Landry family the closure that they're looking for.
The Texas Attorney General's missing person unit did not exist when Jason went missing. I'm hopeful that the AG's office has another technique or another tool. So the fact that they were willing to step up and go, yeah, we'll take a crack at it, we're very appreciative of that.
I believe it is a turning point. I believe it is good for the case to, again, look at it from a different set of eyes. The Attorney General's investigator is aware of the people and the witnesses, and we're grateful that they've reached out to us and consider us a resource. That's what we're here for.
Hopefully, the Attorney General's office might be able to break through that impasse and maybe get some new useful information and crack the case.
The people in our community want to know, is there a bad guy out there? Is there some nefarious character that's visiting harm to our friends and our family and our community? What we can say with confidence is that we don't think so, right? We don't believe that to be true. I maintain, and this is a tragedy, but it's not a crime. There's no reason to believe that anybody in the world has information on Jason Landry except Jason Landry.
Jason resonated with many of the people in a special way. I mean, strangers around the country that speak of Jason. There's Facebook pages, and their sole purpose is to find Jason. I hear the passion in their posts about, Jason being just like their son.
I do hold out hope. I hope that for his family's sake, there's an answer. A day doesn't go by where I don't think about the friend that I lost and how hard it's been since then. He was a really good person and a good friend.
I thank God for Jason, for the man he was and is, and the impact that he has had on so many people's lives. Last time I saw him in person was he was walking out the door for Thanksgiving, and he's heading back to school. And I remember telling him, I'll see you in a couple of weeks for Christmas.
The tide was coming in when they found her, the sea pushing forward like it wanted to erase something, to swallow the evidence before anyone could name it. A dog walker saw the shape first, something pale against the shingle, half in water, half in shadow. For a moment he thought it was driftwood. Then the waves pulled back, and the driftwood had fingers. August 2004. A quiet seaside town on the southern coast of the United Kingdom, the kind of place where postcards show Kenda-striped deck chairs and gulls frozen mid-flight. Summer tourists still filled the promenade that week. Children with melting ice cream. Teenagers with cheap cameras. Retirees sipping tea behind glass windows streaked with salt. No one expected murder to wash ashore with the morning tide. She was 26. Local. A barmaid at a pub 2 streets from the pier. Dark hair tangled with seaweed, eyes open, fixed on a horizon that offered no answers. There were bruises along her wrists. A thin cut near her temple. No obvious weapon. No note. No witness who saw the moment her life ended. Just the cold fact of a body where bodies were not supposed to be. Police sealed off the beach before noon. Blue and white tape snapping in the wind. Officers moving quickly, quietly. Cameras clicking. Reporters arriving faster than the ambulances had. Seaside death shocks community. Young woman found on shore. The headlines began writing themselves before the autopsy even began. Her name was whispered through town like a rumor no one wanted to repeat. She had worked the late shift the night before. Closed up just after midnight. Walked out alone. CCTV from the high street showed her laughing at something on her phone, bag slung over her shoulder, vanishing past the last camera at 12:17 a.m. After that, nothing but darkness. The path from the pub to her flat was familiar. Well lit. 2 minutes from the sea. She had walked it hundreds of times. Friends said she felt safe there. Nothing ever happens here, one of them told reporters, voice trembling. Nothing ever happens here until it does. The post-mortem delivered more questions than comfort. Cause of death, drowning. But the bruises told another story. She had been restrained. There were traces of sand in her lungs inconsistent with where she was found. Meaning she entered the water somewhere else. Meaning someone moved her. The word homicide crept into the investigation like a stain spreading through fabric. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood. Knocked on doors. Asked about screams, arguments, strange cars. A fisherman claimed he saw headlights near the old breakwater around 1 a.m., a vehicle idling longer than usual. A couple staying at a bed and breakfast heard what they thought was a shout carried by the wind, but they couldn't place the direction. The sea distorts sound. It bends reality. The town shifted overnight. Curtains closed earlier. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them cycle alone. The pier, once lively, felt exposed, every creak of wood beneath the boards amplified by fear. Candlelight vigils bloomed near the spot where she was found. Flowers pinned down by pebbles so the wind wouldn't steal them. Her photograph printed in black and white, smiling, unaware of the future rushing toward her like a wave. Police focused first on the obvious. Ex-boyfriend. He had a temper, neighbors said. Loud arguments months earlier. But he had moved to another county. An alibi confirmed by security footage at a petrol station 40 miles away the night she died. Cleared. Then the co-worker, who had offered to walk her home, but left early after a disagreement. He swore he never saw her again after closing time. His phone records placed him at home by 12:30. No sign of deception. Cleared. Days turned into weeks. Forensics combed through her clothing. Found fibers not matching her wardrobe. A dark synthetic thread, common, mass-produced, impossible to trace to a single owner. There was DNA beneath her fingernails, partial, degraded by seawater. Not enough for a match in 2004. Technology had limits then. The lab could only say it likely belonged to a male. Likely. A word that haunted the file. Seaside murder mystery deepens. The press leaned in harder. National outlets arrived. Satellite vans parked along the promenade, cables snaking across pavement. Commentators speculated about a stranger passing through. A drifter. A tourist who had already left the country. The idea of an outsider was easier to swallow than the alternative, that someone local, someone who bought fish and chips on the same corner, had dragged her into the dark and held her under the water until the struggling stopped. Then came the sighting that changed everything and nothing at the same time. A teenager told police he saw her arguing with a man near the dunes shortly after midnight. Tall. Hooded jacket. Face obscured. The kind of description that fits half the population. He said the man grabbed her arm. She pulled away. He assumed it was a lover's quarrel and kept walking. By the time the boy realized what he might have witnessed, it was too late. Officers searched the dunes with metal detectors and dogs. They found a discarded lighter. A crushed beer can. Footprints blurred by wind and time. The sea is ruthless with evidence. It takes and leaves nothing but questions. Autumn arrived. The tourists vanished. Rain replaced sunlight. The case cooled, but it did not disappear. Detectives re-interviewed friends. Dug into her finances. Looked for hidden relationships, secret debts, double lives. They found none. She was ordinary in the way most victims are. Ordinary and gone. Rumors began to fill the silence left by facts. Some said it was a serial predator testing the waters of small towns. Others whispered about drug deals gone wrong, though no drugs were found in her system. An elderly woman insisted she saw a figure standing on the pier at 3 a.m., staring into the waves, as if waiting for something to resurface. Police followed every thread. Each one snapped in their hands. Months later, a composite sketch based on the teenager's account was released. A blurred face turned into ink lines on paper. Eyes shadowed. Jaw indistinct. The town studied it in shop windows and newspapers, searching for familiarity. Some claimed it resembled a delivery driver. Others pointed at a seasonal worker from an arcade, who had already returned home. Tips flooded in. None led to an arrest. The file thickened. Photographs, transcripts, forensic reports stacked inch by inch. A life reduced to paperwork. Detectives aged. New officers inherited the case, reading through summaries written by men who had since retired. Unresolved homicide, the cover read. A cold case born before winter even fully set in. Years passed. Technology evolved. DNA methods improved. In 2012, the evidence was retested. The partial profile beneath her fingernails yielded a clearer result. Still incomplete, but sharper. It was entered into a national database. No match. Not yet. The sea had kept its secret well. The town never truly forgot. On anniversaries, small gatherings formed on the beach. Fewer flowers each year, but the memory remained, stubborn as salt in the air. Parents still told their daughters to avoid walking alone at night. The pub where she worked kept her photograph behind the bar. Regulars would glance at it and fall silent. Then, a decade after the tide first carried her in, a new detective reopened the file with fresh eyes. He noticed a detail buried deep in an early report: tire tracks near the old breakwater photographed, but never conclusively matched. The pattern suggested a specific type of van, popular among tradesmen in the early 2000s. Thousands were sold. But he wondered who in town owned one at the time, and had since left without drawing attention. He built a list. Cross-referenced it with men who had minor records for assault. Petty violence. Nothing major enough to trigger alarms back then. One name surfaced repeatedly in old witness statements: a handyman who did odd jobs along the seafront. Quiet. Kept to himself. Moved away 6 months after the murder. No one thought much of it at the time. People come and go in seaside towns. The handyman had never been formally interviewed. An oversight buried in the chaos of those first frantic weeks. The detective tracked him down. A different county. A different life. Older now. Married. 2 children. No significant criminal record. He agreed to speak voluntarily, calm, almost curious about the renewed interest. He said he barely remembered her. Claimed he was home that night, asleep by 11. No one could confirm it. His wife had met him years later. There was something in his eyes, the detective would later say, something unreadable. But suspicion is not proof. A request was made for a DNA sample. He hesitated, then complied. Weeks passed. The lab worked quietly. The town waited without knowing it was waiting again. And when the call finally came, it was not the triumphant moment anyone had imagined. The DNA was close. Not a direct match. A familial link. Suggesting the source of the sample was related to him, brother, perhaps, or cousin. The net widened once more, stretching across bloodlines and old grudges, pulling at threads that had lain dormant for years. The seaside wind still howls at night along that stretch of beach. The breakwater still stands, stubborn against the tide. Somewhere between the dunes and the dark water, the truth remains suspended, like a breath never released. A young woman walked home under streetlights in 2004 and never reached her door. A town learned how fragile safety can be. And even now, with technology advancing and files reopened, the question lingers heavier than the salt in the air: who held her beneath the waves? And how long can a secret survive before the sea finally gives it back? The DNA result did not bring closure, it detonated a second shockwave. A familial link. Not the handyman himself, but someone tied to his bloodline. The lab report was precise, clinical, almost cold in its delivery: statistical probability, shared markers, likelihood ratios, but beneath the science was a single, volatile implication: the killer might have been closer to him than anyone ever imagined. Detectives moved fast, quietly reopening doors that had been closed for over a decade. The handyman had one brother. Older. Estranged. A history that read like a string of low-level violence, bar fights, a suspended sentence for assault, a restraining order filed by a former partner. Nothing that screamed murderer. Everything that whispered volatility. He had lived in the seaside town in 2004. Not permanently. Just for a few months. Long enough. His name resurfaced in old employment logs from a now-closed amusement arcade near the pier. Temporary maintenance staff. Cash-in-hand wages. No formal contract. The kind of job that leaves little trace. When detectives pulled archived CCTV from nearby shops, grainy, barely watchable relics of early 2000s security, they found nothing usable. Time had eaten the footage years ago. But payroll notes confirmed he worked late shifts that summer, often finishing close to midnight. Witness statements were reread with new eyes. One line, scribbled in the margin of a page dated August 18, 2004, local man, tall, hooded top, seen smoking near dunes earlier that week. The description had been too generic then. Now it felt heavier. The brother was tall. He smoked heavily. Brand preference. Cheap, unfiltered cigarettes. The same type found crushed in the sand near the original search area, logged but dismissed because half the town smoked them. Police requested a voluntary interview. He refused. That refusal shifted the tone. A man with nothing to hide often talks. Not always. But often. Detectives secured a warrant for a covert DNA collection. A discarded coffee cup retrieved from a cafe he frequented. Gloves. Evidence bag. Lab submission. The town didn't know yet, but the case that once defined its fear was breathing again. While waiting for results, investigators reconstructed the final known hour of her life with microscopic detail. The pub closed at midnight. She texted a friend at 12:09 a.m., finally done. Feet killing me. A smiley face. That was the last outgoing message. Her phone stopped transmitting at 12:32 a.m., likely powered off or destroyed. Cell tower pings placed her along the seafront road at 12:18. After that, silence. A new witness emerged during this renewed publicity. A woman who had been a university student in 2004, home for the summer. She said she remembered seeing a van parked awkwardly near the old breakwater that night. White. Slight dent on the rear door. She recalled it because she had nearly clipped it while reversing. Back then, she thought nothing of it. Now, watching news reports about DNA breakthroughs, the memory clawed its way back. The handyman owned a van in 2004. Sold it months after the murder. Records confirmed the sale, but not the buyer. The registration plate had long since been recycled. Investigators checked whether his brother had access to it. According to a neighbor from that time, the two men were seen arguing outside the handyman's flat more than once. Family business, the neighbor had assumed. Family business. The phrase lingered. The lab call came on a gray Thursday morning. This time, there was no ambiguity. The DNA collected from the coffee cup was a direct match to the enhanced profile recovered from beneath her fingernails. Probability of random match, less than 1 in a billion. The numbers were overwhelming. The science had finally caught up with the sea. An arrest warrant was issued before sunset. Officers approached his house at dawn. Quiet suburban street. Trimmed hedges. Curtains still drawn. When they knocked, he opened the door in a t-shirt and sweatpants, confusion flickering across his face before it hardened into something else, calculation, perhaps. He did not resist. He asked only one question: is this about that girl? News traveled faster than the police convoy. 2004 Seaside murder arrest made. Cold case breakthrough. The same promenade that once hosted candlelight vigils now swarmed with camera crews again. Residents stepped out of shops mid-transaction to check their phones. The past had surged forward, uninvited. During interrogation, he denied everything. Claimed he barely knew her. Said he had never spoken to her alone. When confronted with the DNA evidence, he suggested contamination. Transfer. I worked near the beach, he argued. Maybe I touched something she touched. Detectives countered with the location of the DNA, beneath her fingernails, mixed with her blood. Defensive wounds. He had no explanation for that. Hours stretched into a full day. His story shifted subtly. He admitted seeing her that night. "Just a chat," he said. "She was upset. I tried to calm her down." He claimed she slipped on wet rocks near the water, fell, hit her head. "Panic," he said. He tried to pull her out, but couldn't. Afraid of being blamed, he left. The narrative was thin, full of holes. The autopsy had found no head trauma severe enough to render her unconscious before drowning. And what about the bruises on her wrists? Silence. Prosecutors built the case carefully. They argued he confronted her near the dunes, possibly after watching her leave work for weeks. Perhaps there had been an obsession, quiet and festering. An advance rejected. A temper ignited. The bruises suggested restraint. The drowning, deliberate. He held her under until the struggle stopped. Then he moved her body, hoping the tide would do the rest. The defense countered with the absence of eyewitnesses. No murder weapon. No confession. They questioned the chain of custody on evidence stored for over a decade. Suggested the possibility of consensual contact earlier that evening, though no witness supported that claim. They painted him as flawed, but not monstrous. The trial gripped the nation. Courtroom sketches replaced the faded beach photographs from 2004. Her family sat in the front row every day, faces drawn tight, with years of waiting. When forensic experts explained how seawater degrades DNA yet somehow preserved enough of his to identify him years later, jurors leaned forward. Science had become the silent witness who never forgot. He took the stand in his own defense. Voice steady at first. He spoke of his troubled youth, his attempt to rebuild his life, his children who needed their father. He maintained it was a tragic accident compounded by fear. But under cross-examination, cracks appeared. He could not explain inconsistencies in his timeline. Phone records placed him near the breakwater at 12:40 a.m., long after he claimed to be home. When confronted, he faltered. Outside the courthouse, the sea kept moving, indifferent. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days. The town held its breath. Shops closed early. Conversations halted mid-sentence when phones buzzed. And then the verdict came, guilty of murder. A sound rippled through the courtroom, not quite a gasp, not quite relief. More like a release of pressure built over 14 years. He showed little reaction as the sentence was handed down, life imprisonment, minimum term set high enough that he would grow old behind bars. Headlines declared justice served. Seaside murder solved. Family finally sees closure. The promenade filled once more, not with tourists this time, but with residents who gathered near the spot where she had been found. Some cried. Some simply stood, staring at the horizon as if expecting it to answer back. But even with a conviction, questions lingered like fog. Why her? Was it truly spontaneous, or had he planned it? Did anyone else know? Detectives revisited the handyman's role. Was he truly uninvolved? Or had loyalty blinded him? There was no evidence to charge anyone else, yet whispers persisted in quiet corners of the town. Her family spoke to the press only once after sentencing. They thanked investigators. They spoke of her laughter, her stubborn optimism, the way she loved the sea without knowing it would one day take her. They said the word closure, but their eyes suggested something more complicated. Closure is a legal term. Grief does not obey verdicts. At night, the wind still cuts across the beach with the same sharp edge it had in 2004. The breakwater remains, weathered but standing. Visitors walk past without knowing the history beneath their feet. The town appears healed, on the surface. Yet every August, when the tide creeps higher under a pale sky, those who remember feel it, a tightening in the chest, a flash of blue and white tape in their minds. A murder solved does not erase the years it stole. 14 summers passed before science spoke loudly enough to be heard. 14 winters where her case file gathered dust while her family marked birthdays without her. The sea gave up its secret eventually, but only because technology forced its hand. And still, if you stand there at dusk, listening to the waves collide with stone, it is impossible not to imagine that night, the argument swallowed by wind, the sudden violence, the final breath beneath black water. Justice arrived late, heavy and imperfect. The town carries both the relief of an answer and the permanent scar of what it learned. Even in places where nothing ever happens, something can. The verdict should have ended it. A courtroom gavel. A life sentence. Headlines that screamed justice at last. But the sea does not recognize verdicts, and neither does doubt. 3 months after the conviction, a letter arrived at the offices of a national newspaper. No return address. Postmarked from a city 200 miles north. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed, no signature. It contained details about the night of the murder that had never been released to the public, details about the position of her body when it was first discovered, about the specific knot of seaweed tangled in her hair, about the lighter found buried near the dunes. The writer claimed the wrong man was in prison. The police dismissed it publicly as a cruel hoax. Privately, they couldn't ignore the precision. Only a handful of investigators had known about the seaweed detail. It was considered insignificant at the time. A natural occurrence. Not something worth disclosing in press conferences. Yet the letter described it exactly, wrapped tight around her left wrist like a bracelet. That phrasing matched the original crime scene log almost word for word. Detectives reopened internal files again, this time not to chase a suspect, but to examine themselves. Who had access? Who might have leaked? Retired officers were contacted. Lab technicians questioned. No clear breach emerged. The man in prison maintained his innocence through every appeal filed so far. Now his lawyers seized the letter as potential leverage. They argued the investigation had been too eager to accept the DNA match as a complete narrative. They pointed out the familial connection to the handyman and suggested the possibility of secondary transfer, brothers sharing tools, vehicles, even clothing. They demanded re-examination of all physical evidence, claiming tunnel vision had guided the final push toward conviction. The public, once unified in relief, began to fracture. Talk radio reignited the case. Could police have got it wrong? Online forums dissected trial transcripts line by line. Amateur sleuths surfaced archived photos of the breakwater, analyzing shadows and tide charts, as if the answer were hidden in pixelated darkness. Meanwhile, a new forensic review began quietly behind closed doors. Advanced touch DNA testing, far more sensitive than anything available in 2004, or even 2012, was applied to the preserved evidence. Her clothing. The fibers. The crushed beer can. The discarded lighter. And then another anomaly surfaced. A partial DNA profile was lifted from the lighter, one that did not match the convicted man. It was incomplete, fragmented, but undeniably distinct. Investigators felt the ground shift beneath them. The lighter had always been considered incidental. Found near the dunes, common brand, nothing directly tying it to the victim. But now it carried a whisper of someone else. The prosecution maintained that the presence of another profile did not exonerate the man in prison. Beaches are public places. Lighters change hands. But defense attorneys sharpened their arguments. If another unidentified male was at the dunes that night, why was he never found? Why was his DNA not pursued with equal intensity? The letter writer struck again. This time the message was shorter. You missed the van. That was all it said. Detectives revisited the white van lead. The original conviction had relied heavily on DNA beneath her fingernails and phone data placing the defendant near the breakwater. The van had supported the timeline, but was never the centerpiece. Now it demanded center stage. Records showed the handyman sold his van 2 months after the murder. The buyer. A cash transaction, poorly documented. But an old insurance cancellation form surfaced in archived paperwork. It listed a temporary secondary driver during that summer, his brother. The same man now serving life. The implication was clear, he had access to the vehicle. But so did someone else. A third name appeared in faded handwriting on the back of that same form. A friend. A drinking companion. A man with a minor theft conviction, who had since died in 2010 from a drug overdose. He had also worked briefly at the arcade. He had also been known to borrow vehicles without asking too many questions. Investigators tracked down his surviving relatives. Asked about his movements in August 2004. Most memories were blurred by time and addiction. One sister recalled him coming home late one night that summer, agitated, clothes damp. She assumed it was rain. She remembered because he threw his trainers away the next day, claiming they were ruined. Trainers. The original crime scene report had noted partial shoe impressions near the dunes. Size roughly 10. Common tread pattern. Inconclusive. The convicted man wore size 9. It was a small discrepancy, explained away at trial as margin of error. Now it looked different. The prosecution resisted calls for a retrial, arguing the DNA under her fingernails remained definitive. Experts testified again that secondary transfer into that location, beneath broken nails, mixed with her blood, was extraordinarily unlikely without direct struggle. But the defense countered with a new theory: what if there had been 2 men? What if the argument near the dunes escalated beyond one person's control? What if she fought one attacker, scratching him, while another held her down? What if fear and loyalty sealed mouths afterward? The sea had hidden more than one secret before. Public confidence wavered as appeals courts agreed to review the new forensic findings. News vans returned to the promenade yet again. Residents who thought they had buried the past found it unearthed in headlines once more. New DNA casts shadow on seaside murder conviction. The words reopened wounds that had barely scarred. Inside prison, the convicted man watched the coverage with quiet intensity. Through his solicitor, he issued a statement: "I did not kill her. I was there, but I did not kill her." It was the first time he admitted presence at the moment of death. That single sentence changed everything. Under renewed questioning years earlier, he had claimed accident, panic, leaving her alive. Now he conceded he was there when she died. The contradiction was explosive. Prosecutors argued it proved shifting lies. The defense said trauma and fear distort memory. Either way, the night at the breakwater grew darker, more crowded. Reconstruction experts returned to the beach with modern equipment. Laser mapping. Tide simulations. They calculated how long it would have taken for a body placed at a specific point to wash ashore where she was found. Their findings suggested she entered the water closer to the dunes than originally assumed. A spot partially shielded from the main promenade. A spot where 2, or even 3 people could struggle unseen. The lighter's partial DNA was run through updated national and international databases. No match. The unknown male remained just that, unknown. The dead friend's DNA, however, was more difficult to obtain. Exhumation required legal permission and family consent. The request ignited ethical debate. Was it justifiable to disturb a grave based on partial evidence? Ultimately, a court order was granted. Years after his overdose, his remains were tested. The result landed like a crack through glass. The partial profile from the lighter was consistent with the deceased friend. Consistent. Not absolute. But strong enough to matter. The narrative shifted again. If he had been present that night, if his DNA lay near the dunes, if he borrowed the van, if he came home with damp clothes and discarded shoes, then what role did he play? Accomplice? Instigator? Witness who stayed silent? And what about the man already imprisoned? Appeal hearings grew tense. Judges weighed scientific nuance against jury verdicts. Families on both sides sat rigid in wooden benches polished by decades of other tragedies. The prosecution maintained that even if another man was present, the convicted individual's DNA beneath her fingernails and his evolving statements demonstrated primary responsibility. The defense insisted reasonable doubt now roared where once it only whispered. Outside, the sea remained indifferent, slamming against stone with mechanical rhythm. Years after the supposed closure, the case no longer fit neatly into solved. It had mutated into something more unsettling, a solved murder unraveling thread by thread. The community that once rallied around a conviction now found itself suspended between relief and uncertainty. Was justice served? Or had it been rushed by the hunger for answers? Every anniversary now carried a different weight. Not just remembrance of her life, but the heavy question of truth. 2 men potentially involved, 1 dead, 1 imprisoned. A struggle in darkness no living witness could fully recount. A letter writer, who had vanished as mysteriously as they appeared. In the fading light along the promenade, locals sometimes claim they can still see the flicker of blue lights reflected on water, even though the patrol cars left years ago. Memory has a way of projecting ghosts onto empty spaces. The breakwater stands unchanged, but the story around it refuses to settle. It twists, resurfaces, drags old certainties back under. A murder once declared solved now hangs in uneasy balance, suspended between science and shadow. And somewhere within that narrow strip of sand between dunes and tide, the full truth of that August night remains locked in silence, waiting, perhaps, for the next piece of evidence to rise with the sea. The exhumation changed the temperature of the case. When the court authorized the opening of the grave, it wasn't just a legal step, it was a statement that certainty had fractured. Under gray skies, in a quiet cemetery miles from the sea, forensic teams worked with mechanical precision, while a handful of reporters watched from behind barriers. The man who had died of an overdose in 2010 was being dragged back into a story he never publicly answered for. The DNA comparison came back stronger than anyone expected. The partial profile lifted from the lighter near the dunes was not just consistent, it was highly probable. The dead friend had handled that lighter. On its own, it proved nothing. But placed beside everything else, it felt like a door cracking open to a darker room. The defense seized it immediately. Their argument sharpened, 2 men at the scene, 1 now buried, 1 imprisoned. They suggested a scenario where the deceased friend initiated the confrontation, volatile, intoxicated, unpredictable. The convicted man, they claimed, panicked in the chaos. Presence did not equal murder. DNA under fingernails could reflect a desperate attempt to pull her away from someone else. The narrative shifted from predator to bystander caught in violence spiraling out of control. Prosecutors countered with a harder edge. They acknowledged the dead man's possible presence, but insisted the physical evidence still pointed to a sustained struggle between the victim and the defendant. The bruising on her wrists. The defensive scratches. The timeline aligning his phone with the breakwater minutes before her phone went dark. They argued that adding another man to the scene did not erase the core act. Someone held her under. And the DNA under her nails did not belong to a ghost, it belonged to the man serving life. The appeals court ordered a full evidentiary review. Suddenly, every assumption from 2004 felt unstable. Detectives who once celebrated the conviction were called back to testify about investigative choices made under pressure. Why had the lighter been dismissed initially? Why were the shoe impressions not pursued more aggressively? Why had the white van's secondary drivers not been fully interrogated at the outset? The answer was always the same: limited resources, evolving technology, the chaos of a high-profile case. But to grieving families and skeptical observers, those explanations felt thin. Then the letter writer resurfaced. This time, the message was sent directly to the appellate court clerk. 3 sentences. You are closer now. He didn't act alone. Look at the pier camera. There had never been a functional camera on the pier in 2004, or so everyone believed. The original investigation noted that the old CCTV unit mounted near the arcade entrance had been broken for months before the murder. No footage was ever recovered. But during the evidentiary review, a retired council technician came forward with something almost forgotten: backup tapes from a short-lived pilot surveillance system installed that summer. The system had been poorly maintained and quickly abandoned. The tapes were archived in municipal storage, mislabeled under routine infrastructure maintenance. Dust-covered boxes were retrieved from a warehouse. The footage quality was primitive, blurred by salt corrosion and low resolution. Most of it was unusable. But one segment, time-stamped just after 12:20 a.m. on the night she died, showed movement near the edge of the frame. 2 male figures walking briskly toward the dunes from the direction of the pier. One tall. One slightly shorter, heavier build. The taller man appeared to be wearing a hooded top. The timestamp aligned with her last known phone ping. The courtroom fell silent when the clip was played during the appeal hearing. It was only a few seconds long. Faces indistinguishable. But the body language was tense, urgent. And crucially, there were 2 of them. The prosecution adjusted strategy again. They now argued joint enterprise, 2 men involved in a confrontation that ended in murder. Even if the deceased friend played a role, the convicted man's physical evidence tied him directly to the fatal struggle. The defense pushed back, claiming the new footage undermined the original prosecution narrative that centered on a single aggressor acting alone. Outside the courthouse, the public no longer spoke in absolutes. Conversations in cafes shifted from "he did it" to "what really happened." The community that once demanded justice now demanded truth, even if it complicated the story. Then another fragment emerged from the past. An old pub regular, now living abroad, contacted investigators after seeing international coverage of the appeal. He recalled a heated argument between the convicted man and the deceased friend weeks before the murder. According to him, the fight was about money owed from small-time drug dealing along the seafront. The victim's name had been mentioned, not as a participant, but as someone who talked too much. Detectives re-examined her phone records with modern analytics. Deleted messages were partially recovered from cloud backups that hadn't existed in 2004. Among them was an exchange with a friend hinting at discomfort. "Those 2 creeps from the arcade keep staring." The message was dated 3 days before her death. Creeps. Plural. The narrative was no longer a straight line. It was a knot. Appeal judges faced a complex question. Did the new evidence fundamentally undermine the safety of the conviction? Or did it simply expand the circle of culpability, without absolving the man imprisoned? After weeks of deliberation, the ruling arrived. The conviction would stand, for now. The court determined that the DNA evidence beneath her fingernails, combined with the defendant's shifting accounts and proximity to the scene, still provided a safe basis for the jury's decision. However, the judgment acknowledged the disturbing likelihood that another individual was involved in events leading to her death. A line in the written decision echoed across headlines: "The full truth of that night may never be entirely known." For her family, the ruling was bittersweet. They retained a legal conclusion, but lost the simplicity of a single villain. The idea that their daughter's final moments involved multiple attackers was a heavier burden than the original narrative allowed. For the man in prison, it was another door closing, but not completely. His legal team vowed to continue pursuing avenues for retrial, citing the unidentified letter writer and the possibility of withheld evidence. And the letter writer remained the most unsettling piece of all. Investigators traced the postmarks, analyzed paper fibers, tested envelopes for touched DNA. Nothing usable. The author seemed to operate just close enough to the truth to inflame doubt, yet far enough to remain invisible. Some speculated it was someone within the original investigation, burdened by guilt. Others believed it could be an associate of the deceased friend, someone who knew fragments of the night, but lacked the courage to fully confess. At the breakwater, nothing had changed physically. But perception had. Tourists walked past unaware that beneath the calm facade lay a crime scene that refused to rest. The wind still tore across the dunes with the same sharpness it had in 2004. The sea still swallowed secrets with methodical patience. Late one evening, nearly 2 decades after the murder, a retired detective returned alone to the shoreline. He stood where the body had been found, watching the tide roll in. He had been young then, eager to solve his first major homicide. He believed they had succeeded. Now he wasn't sure what success meant. 2 men walking toward the dunes. One dead. One in prison. A lighter in the sand. Scratches beneath broken nails. A letter writer whispering from the shadows. The case was legally closed but morally unsettled. In the quiet that followed the appellate decision, the town tried again to move forward. Shops reopened without news vans blocking the pavement. The pub replaced her faded photograph with a new frame. Life continued because it had to. But every so often, when the wind shifts and the tide creeps higher than expected, someone remembers the night a young woman vanished between streetlight and shoreline. They remember how quickly certainty can dissolve. They remember that even a solved murder can unravel when buried truths begin to rise. And somewhere, perhaps, the person who wrote those letters still watches the coverage, still measures what the world knows against what remains hidden. Because despite convictions, appeals, and exhumations, one truth lingers heavier than any verdict. On that August night in 2004, more than one shadow moved across the sand, and not all of them have been named. The years did not quiet the case. They deepened it. After the appeal ruling, the headlines faded again, but something had shifted permanently. The narrative was no longer clean. It was layered, unstable, charged with the possibility that the truth had only been partially exposed. In legal terms, the murder was solved. In the court of public conscience, it was anything but. Then came the storm. Not metaphorical, real. A winter gale that tore across the southern coast nearly 20 years after her death. Winds violent enough to rip planks from the pier. Waves crashing hard against the breakwater, clawing at the shoreline with a force not seen in decades. Emergency crews sealed off the promenade overnight. Sandbags. Flashing lights. The sea in full fury. When the storm retreated, it left behind damage, and something else. A council worker inspecting erosion along the dunes noticed a metallic glint protruding from newly exposed sand several meters inland from where the body had been found in 2004. At first, He thought it was debris from the pier. But the object was older. Rusted. Partially buried, as if the sea had been slowly working to return it. Police were called. The item was a mobile phone. Early 2000s model. Battery corroded, casing cracked, but intact enough to identify the make. The same model she had owned. Her phone had never been recovered. In 2004, investigators believed it had been thrown into deep water or destroyed. Now, 2 decades later, the dunes were giving something back. Forensic teams handled it like an explosive device. The SIM card was removed, carefully dried, transferred to a lab specializing in data extraction from water-damaged electronics. Technology had evolved again. What was impossible in 2004 was now routine. The town held its breath for the 3rd time in 20 years. When the data retrieval process completed, it yielded fragments. Corrupted text messages. Partial call logs. Timestamps. Enough to reconstruct the final minutes with greater clarity. At 12:21 a.m., she received a call. Not from a saved contact. The number was unregistered, prepaid, later deactivated within days of the murder. The call lasted 43 seconds. At 12:23 a.m., she sent a draft message that was never delivered. The text was incomplete, cut off mid-word. They are following me. They are fighting. They are forcing. The phone powered down at 12:24. That timestamp aligned almost exactly with the pier camera footage of 2 men walking toward the dunes. The prosecution's case had argued confrontation at the dunes. But this suggested prelude, pursuit. The prepaid number was traced as far as possible. Purchased with cash at a convenience shop 40 miles inland. CCTV from the purchase had long since been erased. But the location mattered. It was the same town where the deceased friend had lived before moving to the coast. Investigators constructed a chilling possibility. The call may have been used to lure her outside, to isolate her. A coordinated action. Inside prison, the convicted man was informed of the discovery through his solicitor. His response was immediate and explosive. He requested another interview with detectives. This time, he spoke differently. He admitted that the deceased friend had been with him that night. He claimed the friend was the one who initiated contact, the one who phoned her from a disposable mobile after seeing her leave work. He described an argument escalating fast, accusations, insults, threats. According to him, the friend grabbed her first. She fought back. She scratched him. He insisted he tried to intervene. Then he paused. He said she slipped near the water's edge during the struggle. He said his friend panicked, held her down to scare her, and it went too far. He said he shouted for him to stop. He said he froze. It was a convenient narrative, one that shifted primary blame to a man no longer alive to defend himself. Prosecutors were skeptical. But the existence of the call and the second DNA profile complicated dismissal. Detectives cross-checked the prepaid phone's limited metadata, with cell tower logs preserved in telecom archives. Astonishingly, the device had pinged near the seafront minutes before the call to her. It had also pinged near the deceased friend's residence earlier that evening. The dead man's sister was re-interviewed. This time, she revealed something she had never disclosed. In 2004, days after the murder, she overheard her brother arguing with someone on the phone. He said, "It wasn't meant to happen like that." She had assumed it was about drugs. She never connected it to the girl found on the beach. Now, the words sounded different. The legal dilemma intensified. Could the conviction stand if credible evidence suggested shared responsibility, possibly even primary responsibility, by the deceased friend. Joint enterprise laws allowed conviction even if the defendant did not deliver the fatal act, provided participation in a dangerous confrontation was proven. But morally, the distinction mattered. The letter writer never resurfaced after the phone discovery. Some investigators quietly theorized the author might have been the deceased friend's former partner or associate, someone who suspected the truth but lacked proof. Others believed the letters were written by the convicted man himself through intermediaries, an attempt to seed doubt. The dunes where the phone was found were cordoned off again, echoing images from 2004. Ground-penetrating radar scanned for additional buried items. Nothing significant emerged. If there had been more evidence, the sea had long since claimed it. A reconstruction was staged under controlled conditions. 2 actors reenacted the movements suggested by footage and data: approach from the pier, call placed, confrontation near the dunes, struggle shifting toward the water. Experts testified that 2 aggressors would have significantly reduced her ability to escape. Defensive wounds under fingernails could belong to either attacker, depending on who she reached. The scratch marks documented on the convicted man's arms in 2004 had been noted, but not photographed in detail. They were described as superficial. The deceased friend's body, examined after overdose years later, had no preserved evidence of past scratch scars that could definitively link him. Time had erased that possibility. The public mood shifted once more, from certainty to doubt to something more complex: shared guilt. Some argued the man in prison remained culpable regardless. He had lured her or at least agreed to confront her. He had not called for help. He had left her in the water. Others questioned whether his life sentence reflected the full nuance of events. Her family, when approached for comment after the phone discovery, declined interviews. Through a brief written statement, they said only this: what happened that night involved cowardice. Whether by one man or more, our daughter was surrounded by it. The sea returned to calm as spring approached. Tourists came back. The promenade filled with laughter again. But beneath it all, the case had evolved into something heavier than a single crime. It had become a study in how truth can fragment over time, how evidence can surface decades later, and still fail to illuminate every shadow. One question lingered louder than the rest: if the deceased friend had lived, would he have confessed? Or would silence have prevailed forever? The convicted man's legal team filed another petition, arguing for sentence review based on emerging evidence suggesting diminished individual culpability. The court agreed to hear arguments, but made no promises. And so the case continued, not as a simple seaside murder solved, but as a shifting mosaic of half-revealed truths. A prepaid phone. A draft message cut off mid-word. 2 figures in grainy footage. A lighter buried in sand. A body carried by tide. Justice had been declared once. Now it was being re-examined under harsher light. On quiet evenings, when the tide creeps in under a fading sky, the breakwater casts long shadows across the water. Somewhere in that darkness lies the precise sequence of seconds that ended a life. Science has pulled pieces back from the sea. Courts have weighed them carefully. But even now, with phones unearthed and graves reopened, the full shape of that night remains just beyond reach, blurred like the figures on that old pier camera, forever walking toward the dunes. The phone changed the rhythm of everything. For nearly 2 decades, the case had revolved around physical struggle, bruises, scratches, drowned lungs, sand in hair. Now it revolved around intention. A 43-second call. A prepaid number. A draft message cut off mid-word. They are for 2 letters that refused to fade. Following. Forcing. Fooling. The prosecution had built its original case on confrontation that escalated. But the recovered phone data suggested something colder: coordination before contact. The call wasn't random. It was timed. It came minutes after she left work, as if someone had been watching. Investigators reconstructed her route again, this time overlaying modern geospatial mapping with preserved 2004 cell tower logs. The prepaid phone pinged from the promenade before dialing her. It wasn't a distant lure. It was local. Close enough to see her step into the streetlight. Then came a detail buried in telecom archives that no one had noticed before. The prepaid phone had received one incoming call earlier that night, at 11:58 p.m. duration, 11 seconds. The number it connected with belonged to the convicted man. That connection detonated in the appeal chamber. For years, he had maintained that the deceased friend acted impulsively. Now records showed coordination, contact before the victim even locked the pub doors. 11 seconds. Enough for a signal. She's finishing soon. Enough for agreement. Under renewed questioning, the prisoner adjusted again. He claimed the call was unrelated, just routine contact. He insisted he didn't know the friend intended to call her. But the timing tightened like wire around his story. Digital forensic experts testified that prepaid phones in 2004 were often used to avoid traceability. Cheap. Disposable. Perfect for planning something that shouldn't leave fingerprints. The fact that it was deactivated days after the murder suggested deliberate disposal. The court began examining not just who held her under the water, but who orchestrated the meeting at the dunes. Meanwhile, investigators re-interviewed former co-workers from the arcade. One woman, now living abroad, recalled something chilling. She remembered the deceased friend joking weeks before the murder about teaching the barmaid a lesson, because she had laughed at him in front of others. She thought it was crude, drunk talk. She never imagined it as foreshadowing. Laughter. Ego. Humiliation. Small sparks that sometimes ignite lethal fires. The prosecution's revised theory formed with brutal clarity: the two men watched her for weeks. Obsession disguised as casual presence. The arcade across from the promenade gave them a vantage point. The pub's closing time predictable. That night, after a brief coordinating call, the friend used the prepaid phone to draw her toward the dunes, perhaps under false pretenses, perhaps threatening, perhaps claiming someone needed help. When she realized she was being cornered, she texted the unfinished warning. They are fur. The peer footage showed them moving with urgency. Not wandering. Not coincidental. In court, experts demonstrated how two attackers dramatically increase control over a victim. One restrains. One intimidates. The struggle shifts toward water not by accident, but by force of numbers. Bruising on her wrists suggested grip from the front. Scratches on the convicted man's arms placed him within reach. The lighter with the deceased friend's DNA placed him nearby. Joint enterprise solidified. But something else surfaced during this phase, an overlooked detail from the original autopsy. Beneath layers of documentation was a note about faint bruising along her upper left arm, inconsistent with the defendant's dominant hand. In 2004, it was attributed to chaotic struggle. Now, it aligned with the possibility of a second restraining grip from a man of heavier build, matching the deceased friend's physique. The defense pivoted. They no longer argued innocence. They argued hierarchy of blame. They painted the deceased friend as volatile, dominant, the primary aggressor. They described the convicted man as weak, complicit through fear, but not the one who forced her head beneath water. They sought reduction, from principal murderer to accessory in a violent act gone wrong. Her family sat motionless, as these distinctions were debated like academic variables. Accessory. Principle. As if the sea had measured the difference. Outside the courtroom, public opinion fractured again. Some insisted shared guilt still equaled murder. Others questioned whether one man should bear the full weight, while another lay beyond earthly judgment. Then came the most unsettling development yet. A retired Coast Guard officer contacted police after watching televised coverage of the renewed hearings. He reported that in the early hours following the murder, around 2:10 a.m., he had observed two figures near the waterline while conducting a routine shoreline patrol. At the time, he assumed they were intoxicated tourists. He remembered one bending down repeatedly, as if rinsing hands or clothing in the surf. He thought nothing of it. He never connected it to the body discovered hours later. His logbook from that night, preserved in archives, confirmed the timestamp and approximate location, within 50 meters of where she entered the water. Two figures. Not one. The prosecution argued the sighting reinforced joint presence after the drowning, two men ensuring evidence washed away. The defense countered that the Coast Guard could not identify faces, and that memory decades later is fragile. But the image lodged itself in the collective mind, two silhouettes at the water's edge, waves striking their legs, one crouched, scrubbing something invisible in darkness. Blood diluted by tide. The appeals panel convened once more. This time, they ruled not to overturn the conviction, but to reclassify the legal interpretation. The judgment acknowledged that the murder was carried out in concert with another individual. The life sentence remained. The minimum term unchanged. But the official record shifted, from solitary killer to joint perpetrators. It was a technical amendment, yet emotionally seismic. The deceased friend could never stand trial. His overdose had sealed that chapter. But in the public record, his name was now permanently attached to the murder. The convicted man reacted with visible fury when informed. Through his solicitor, he released a statement: "I never meant for her to die." Not denial. Not anymore. Intent redefined as absence rather than action. The phone, the call, the draft message, they reshaped the final minutes into something orchestrated, not spontaneous. Still, one piece refused to settle. The letter writer. If the letters had aimed to suggest multiple perpetrators, they had succeeded. But how did the author know about the pier footage before it was rediscovered? How did they know about the van's secondary drivers? The timing of each letter aligned eerily with moments when the case approached complacency, as if someone were nudging investigators forward whenever certainty calcified. Speculation turned inward. Could it have been someone within law enforcement who suspected dual involvement years earlier, but lacked proof? Could it have been a relative of the deceased friend who pieced fragments together over time? Or was it the convicted man orchestrating doubt from behind bars? Forensic linguists analyzed phrasing patterns, sentence structure, word choice. Nothing definitive. The sea remained mute. As summer returned once more to the promenade, a memorial plaque was installed near the breakwater, not just in her name, but with a broader inscription, "In memory of truth, long sought." It was subtle, ambiguous, fitting. Visitors pause there now without fully knowing the layers beneath their feet. Two men walking toward dunes. A prepaid call. A draft message cut short. A body carried by tide. A lighter buried in sand for years. A phone hidden by shifting earth. Legally, the case stands resolved. But in quiet moments, when wind skims low over water and gulls circle without sound, the scene feels less like closure and more like aftermath. Because even with coordination proven and dual presence acknowledged, one question remains suspended like mist above the sea. In those final seconds, when the water closed over her and panic fractured into silence, who held her down? And who hesitated just long enough to let it happen. After the court amended the record to reflect joint perpetrators, something strange happened. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not relief. A thick, waiting silence, as if the story had paused mid-sentence and everyone sensed there was still a final clause missing. The convicted man stopped giving interviews. No more statements through solicitors. No more subtle shifts in language. He retreated inward, refusing further cooperation, unless guaranteed immunity from additional charges, a legal impossibility. His silence felt different this time. Not defensive. Calculating. Then, almost 21 years after the murder, a prison psychologist filed a routine behavioral report that would quietly reignite everything. In a monitored session, the prisoner had reportedly said, he wouldn't stop. I told him that was enough. The statement wasn't a confession. It wasn't even made in a legal interview. But it was recorded. Enough. Enough of what? Prosecutors obtained the transcript. The defense argued context, that it could refer to anything. But the timing was impossible to ignore. The appeals decision had cemented joint responsibility. The psychological weight of shared guilt was tightening. Meanwhile, forensic specialists took one more look at the autopsy findings, this time using biomechanical modeling unavailable in 2004. They analyzed the force required to hold a struggling adult under shallow tidal water. The conclusion was stark. Sustained downward pressure from above, likely using body weight, would have been necessary for the duration required to cause drowning. Not a brief panic. Not accidental submersion. Intentional restraint. And here was the detail that chilled even seasoned investigators. The bruising pattern along her upper back suggested a knee or shin pressed between her shoulder blades. Two attackers would not have been necessary to drown her. But two would have made resistance nearly impossible. Investigators returned to the old arcade building, long since converted into luxury flats. Structural blueprints revealed something that had never been publicly discussed: a narrow rear exit leading directly toward the dunes, bypassing the main promenade. In 2004, it had been used by staff for cigarette breaks. If both men had worked late shifts that summer, they would have known that path intimately. A shortcut. A shadow route invisible to most passers-by. That detail aligned with the pier footage. The figures weren't coming from random darkness. They were moving with familiarity. A new witness surfaced unexpectedly, a former seasonal worker, who had been 16 at the time of the murder. She had never spoken up, because she believed what she saw was unrelated. But watching the documentary coverage decades later stirred something. She remembered seeing the deceased friend pacing near the arcade's rear exit around closing time that night. He wasn't working. He was waiting. When she asked who he was meeting, he allegedly said, "Just settling something." Settling. The phrase echoed disturbingly against the earlier testimony about teaching a lesson. The prosecution began quietly exploring a possibility that had not been formally charged before: premeditated confrontation escalating into lethal violence. The prepaid phone. The coordinating 11-second call. The pacing near the rear exit. It was no longer just a drunken argument gone wrong. It felt staged. The defense pushed back aggressively. They argued memory contamination, witnesses influenced by years of media narratives. They pointed out that no written statement from 2004 mentioned the rear exit encounter. They accused authorities of retrofitting evidence to match a theory hardened over time. The psychological report, however, refused to fade. He wouldn't stop. Who was he? If the convicted man was telling the truth in fragments, it implied escalation beyond his control. That he had urged restraint. That he had not anticipated death. But urging is not intervening. Words without action. Prosecutors subpoenaed prison therapy session notes spanning several years. In multiple entries, the psychologist documented recurring themes: guilt associated with freezing, resentment toward a louder personality, and recurring nightmares involving water pressing from above. Water pressing from above. That phrasing aligned eerily with the biomechanical findings. Outside prison walls, the community's relationship with the case had evolved into something generational. Younger residents knew it only through podcasts and headlines. Older ones remembered candlelight flickering against sea wind. The story had become folklore, cautionary and unresolved in emotional terms. Then came a development no one predicted. A storage unit auctioned off after unpaid rent yielded a box of old cassette tapes belonging to the deceased friend. Among them was a microrecorder device popular in the early 2000s. Inside, investigators found fragments of recorded conversations, mostly mundane, drunken banter, music playing in the background. But on one tape, time-stamped days before the murder, a voice believed to be the convicted man could be heard saying, "Just scare her. That's it. Then she'll shut up." The audio was degraded. Experts could not guarantee absolute voice identification. But the cadence matched known recordings. Scare her. The phrase reframed intent. Perhaps death was not the plan. Perhaps humiliation was. Intimidation. A warning. Something to assert dominance and reclaim wounded pride. But once water fills lungs, intention becomes irrelevant. The tape did not contain the murder. It contained prelude. And in criminal law, prelude can be as damning as act. The defense argued the tape was inadmissible, context unclear, authenticity questionable. Yet its existence reinforced a pattern: coordination, discussion, anticipation. Back at the shoreline, erosion continued its slow excavation of the past. Archaeologists, assisting forensic teams, mapped how sand displacement over 2 decades could have concealed and revealed objects like the phone. Their report concluded something subtle, but significant. The phone's location suggested it had been deliberately buried shallowly rather than lost accidentally. Deliberately. Meaning someone, after the drowning, took time to conceal evidence in dunes rather than tossing it into deep water. That act implied calm enough to think beyond panic. 2 men at the waterline. One bending repeatedly. The Coast Guard's memory sharpened under cross-examination. He was now certain he saw one figure standing upright, arms folded, while the other crouched. Standing. Watching. The image burrowed into the public psyche. The prosecution began constructing an updated narrative for potential future review, not to overturn the conviction, but to solidify historical truth. In this version, the deceased friend initiated aggression. The convicted man facilitated the meeting. Both participated in the confrontation. During the struggle, one applied sustained force, while the other failed to intervene decisively. Afterward, both attempted to erase traces, washing, burying, discarding. It was a mosaic assembled from fragments recovered over 21 years. But even mosaics have missing tiles. The letter writer was never identified. No fingerprints. No DNA. No surveillance. Their role remains an anomaly, too informed to be random, too invisible to be traced. Some investigators privately believe the letters came from someone inside the deceased friend's circle, someone who suspected involvement, but lacked proof until media coverage confirmed fragments. Others fear it could have been one of the 2 men testing whether investigators were close. In the end, the prison psychologist's report, the cassette tape, the biomechanical analysis, they did not reopen the trial. They did something subtler. They shifted moral gravity. The convicted man remains incarcerated. His minimum term stretches long ahead. The deceased friend lies in a grave marked by a name now permanently tethered to murder in official documents. The arcade is gone. The rear exit sealed. The pier reinforced. But the breakwater stands. And if you walk there at dusk, when tide meets stone and wind cuts low, you can almost reconstruct it. The call at 12:21. The draft message. 2 figures emerging from shadowed exit. Words exchanged sharp as salt air. A shove. Resistance. Sand scraping skin. Water rising over ankles, then knees. Panic shifting into terror. One voice saying, enough. Another not stopping. The sea swallowing the rest. Even after 2 decades, even after convictions amended and evidence unearthed, the case resists perfect clarity. Because in the final seconds, when pressure met bone and breath dissolved into black water, only 3 people truly knew what happened. One is buried. One is imprisoned. And one has been silent since the tide carried her in. The case should have calcified by now, 2 decades sealed in court transcripts and forensic reports, but instead it kept breathing, as if the shoreline itself refused to let it fossilize. Every new fragment dragged it forward again, not toward simplicity, but toward something colder, inevitability. After the cassette tape surfaced, investigators turned their attention to motive with renewed aggression. Not the broad strokes, ego, humiliation, dominance, but the precise trigger. What had she talked too much about? What had required scaring her into silence? Financial records from the arcade were re-examined under modern fraud analytics. In 2004, the business operated loosely, cash-heavy, seasonal, chaotic. But buried in old ledgers were irregularities, small nightly discrepancies, skimmed revenue that added up to thousands across the summer. Petty theft. Nothing spectacular. But enough to create tension among employees. Her pub sat directly across the promenade from the arcade. Staff from both establishments overlapped socially. If she had overheard talk of missing money, if she had joked about it, if she had threatened to mention it to someone in authority, the humiliation could have shifted into perceived risk. Then came the breakthrough no one expected. A retired tax investigator, watching renewed coverage of the case, contacted police. In 2005, 1 year after the murder, he had briefly investigated the arcade's owners for suspected underreporting. The inquiry collapsed due to lack of cooperation and poor documentation. But he remembered interviewing 2 maintenance workers, one of them the deceased friend. During questioning about cash handling, the man grew defensive, agitated, repeatedly glancing at the other worker present, the convicted man. The retired investigator recalled something chilling. When asked about discrepancies in late August 2004, the deceased friend had muttered, "Things got sorted after that." Sorted. The date matched the week of the murder. Police subpoenaed archived financial documents from the defunct business. Advanced forensic accounting revealed that after August 2004, the discrepancies abruptly stopped. Clean ledgers. No further skimming detected. The timing pressed hard against coincidence. If she had threatened exposure, public embarrassment led atop financial risk, the confrontation at the dunes may not have been spontaneous humiliation. It may have been damage control. The prosecution quietly reconstructed a new psychological timeline, weeks of low-level theft. Increasing tension. She notices. She jokes. Perhaps she confronts one of them casually. Word spreads. Pride wounded. Fear of exposure grows. A plan forms, not to kill, but to intimidate her into silence. A cool place to isolate her. 2 men waiting in darkness. And then something fractures. A push too hard. A grip too long. A body submerged beyond recovery. Intent morphing into catastrophe. In prison, confronted with the financial angle, the convicted man reportedly went pale. He denied theft. Denied financial motive. But he could not explain why the skimming ceased immediately after her death. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard's testimony about one man standing with arms folded while the other crouched at the shoreline took on darker implication. If one had been scrubbing evidence, blood, sand, fingerprints, the other's posture suggested oversight rather than shock. Standing. Watching. Not panicking. Behavioral analysts were brought in. They reviewed interrogation footage spanning years. They observed micro-expressions when certain names were mentioned. When the deceased friend's name surfaced, the prisoner's jaw tightened. When asked directly who held her down, he blinked rapidly and shifted posture away from the interviewer. Stress markers spiked not when denying presence, but when denying primary force. The conclusion was cautious but pointed. His strongest stress responses occurred around questions of direct physical restraint. Outside the legal chambers, the town wrestled with something heavier than guilt, complicity through silence. For years, rumors had circulated about petty theft at the arcade. People joked about creative accounting. But no one reported it formally. No one imagined it might intersect with murder. The victim's family received a private briefing on the financial findings. They did not comment publicly. But a relative was overheard outside court whispering, all that for a few £1,000s. Money. Ego. Fear. Such small things compared to a life. Then came a final, brutal detail extracted from the recovered phone. Deep within corrupted data, technicians found geolocation metadata attached to the draft message. The coordinates, though imprecise by modern standards, placed her not directly at the dunes, but slightly north, closer to the rear exit path from the arcade. That meant she may have been intercepted sooner than previously believed. Perhaps she never intended to go near the water at all. If the prepaid call lured her toward the rear exit under some pretense, perhaps claiming someone needed help behind the building, then the movement toward the water may have been forced from the beginning. The narrative shifted from confrontation at the dunes to abduction within shouting distance of her workplace. And here lay the final psychological fracture. If she was pulled from near the rear exit, she may have screamed. In 2004, one bed and breakfast guest reported hearing a shout carried by wind but dismissed it. That testimony, once peripheral, now aligned with the revised geolocation. The sea does not just swallow bodies. It swallows sound. As hearings concluded, the appellate court declined further review. The conviction stood. The classification as joint perpetrators remained. Financial motive, while compelling, did not legally alter the established verdict. But history adjusted. Documentaries updated their scripts. Academic journals cited the case as an example of how evolving technology reshapes cold case narratives decades later. Law schools dissected the interplay between initial tunnel vision and later forensic expansion. And yet, even after cassette tapes, prepaid phones, financial records, biomechanical modeling, and psychological transcripts, one element remained untouched: the precise division of action in those final seconds. Did the deceased friend force her under while the other restrained? Did roles reverse in panic? Did one hesitate and the other persist? The sea kept that detail. On the 22nd anniversary of her death, a larger memorial gathering formed near the breakwater. Not driven by headlines this time, but by collective memory. Candles flickered against evening wind. Her name was spoken aloud, not as a symbol, not as a case study, but as a person. A former detective addressed the crowd quietly. He did not speak of guilt or appeals. He spoke of complexity. Of how truth sometimes arrives in layers, decades apart. Of how justice is rarely cinematic and often incomplete. As darkness settled, the tide began to rise again, inch by inch against stone. Two men once walked toward those dunes under cover of night. One lies in earth. One lies behind bars. Between them stretched pride, greed, cowardice, and fear. And somewhere in the invisible space between standing and crouching, between warning and drowning, lies the final, irretrievable truth of that August night. The sea rolls on. It does not confess. But it remembers. The letter arrived without a return address, without fingerprints, without mercy. A single sheet of paper, folded twice, slipped through the metal slot of the station's front desk sometime after midnight. By the time the morning clerk found it, the ink had already dried into something permanent. 3 sentences. No greeting. No signature. Just a line that made every spine in the room stiffen. You were right about the tide. You were wrong about the time. Detectives stared at it in silence. 4 years they had argued about the tide charts from that night in 2004, about whether the sea had risen before or after the fatal blow, about whether the killer had understood the rhythm of the coastline, or simply gotten lucky. That detail had never been released publicly. It had been buried in internal reports, debated behind closed doors, whispered in frustration. And now it was here, taunting them from a blank page. The seaside town had learned to live with the murder the way you learn to live with a scar, visible, sensitive, but no longer bleeding. Tourists returned each summer. Ice cream vans hummed along the promenade. Children ran along the pier, without knowing that 20 years earlier police tape had fluttered there like a warning flag. But the detectives never stopped seeing it. The body on the shingle. The blood diluted by seawater. The footprints half erased by a rising tide. The letter ripped the wound open again. Forensic analysis yielded nothing. No DNA. No trace fibers. The paper itself was common stock, purchased anywhere. The handwriting was printed in block capitals, careful, almost clinical. But it was the content that mattered. Whoever wrote it knew about the tide discrepancy. Knew that investigators had recalculated the waterline 3 separate times. Knew that a 10-minute misjudgment could mean the difference between an interrupted attack and a deliberate staging. The press got wind of it within hours. Cold case twist. Mystery letter rekindles seaside murder. Cameras returned to the promenade, framing the pier against a grey horizon. The community felt the old tremor beneath its feet. Parents who had been young adults in 2004 were now middle-aged, explaining to their teenagers why strangers with microphones were suddenly asking questions again. Inside the station, the mood shifted from cautious optimism to raw urgency. The letter meant the killer was watching. Or someone was. Watching the case, watching the town, watching them. Detective Inspector Hale, now grayer, slower, but no less relentless, read the note for the 100th time. You were right about the tide. You were wrong about the time. It suggested correction. It suggested superiority. It suggested someone who had followed the investigation closely enough to feel ownership over its mistakes. They reopened old interview transcripts. Names resurfaced like debris after a storm. The fisherman who claimed he'd seen a figure near the waterline at 11:40 p.m. The bartender who swore the victim left the pub alone at midnight. The couple arguing in a parked car, who insisted they heard a scream at 12:10. The timeline had always been slippery, like wet stone. Now it felt deliberate. Then came the second shock. A retired forensic oceanographer, once consulted briefly in 2004, contacted the team after seeing the headlines. He had kept his notes. Detailed tidal simulations, based on archived meteorological data. According to his recalculation, the sea would have reached the body nearly 20 minutes earlier than originally believed. 20 minutes that investigators had assumed the killer did not have. 20 minutes that would have allowed careful positioning, perhaps even a conversation before violence. The implication was chilling. The attack might not have been sudden. It might have been prolonged. Intentional. Rumors swelled again. Old suspects felt the heat return. One man, long dismissed due to an assumed alibi, suddenly found reporters at his door. He had claimed to be home by 11:30 that night. But if the timeline shifted, if the window extended, his alibi grew thinner. Police interviewed him again. He was older now, hair thinning, hands trembling not with guilt but with anger. He denied everything. He welcomed DNA testing. He offered access to his phone records from that era, though many were long gone. There was nothing concrete, nothing definitive. Only the sense that the sands beneath the case were moving once more. The letter's author remained invisible. Investigators considered the possibility of a hoax. Someone exploiting public fascination. Someone who had read speculation online and stitched together a clever phrase. But the internal knowledge about the tide calculation was too precise. It narrowed the field. Whoever wrote it had access to confidential discussions, or had been close enough to overhear them. Attention turned inward. Former officers. Civilian staff. Consultants. The idea that the answer had been within the investigative circle all along was almost unbearable. Yet it explained the knowledge. It explained the tone, condescending, intimate. Background checks began quietly. Financial records were scanned. Retirement patterns analyzed. Any unusual behavior over the past 2 decades flagged. The process was methodical, almost surgical. But beneath it pulsed a deeper fear. What if the killer had worn a uniform? What if he had stood at the very scene, nodding gravely, taking notes, hiding in plain sight? Meanwhile, the town fractured between hope and dread. Some believed the letter meant closure was imminent. Others feared it meant the killer was playing a game. Social media buzzed with amateur theories. Old photographs resurfaced online. Grainy images of the pier at dusk. Of the victim laughing at a summer fair days before her death. The human face behind the headline returned, vivid and painful. Detectives re-examined CCTV footage from 2004 using modern enhancement software. Pixels sharpened. Shadows clarified. In one frame, near the edge of the promenade, a figure stood partially obscured by a lamppost. Previously dismissed as a passerby. Now, with enhanced resolution, the posture seemed deliberate. Watching. Waiting. The timestamp hovered just before midnight. They traced the camera's coverage, mapped potential escape routes. Cross-referenced vehicle registrations from that night. One plate, barely visible in the background of another frame, led to a car owned by a now-deceased local businessman. He had died 5 years after the murder in what was ruled an accidental fall down his own staircase. At the time, there had been no reason to connect him to the case. He had no criminal record. He was respected. Generous to local charities. But the proximity of his vehicle to the scene reopened questions. His family cooperated reluctantly, allowing access to old belongings stored in a loft. Boxes of papers. Diaries. Receipts. Among them, a tide chart printed from a maritime website, dated a week before the murder. The room fell silent when investigators found it. It wasn't proof. It wasn't a confession. But it was a thread, thin, fragile, undeniable. Why would he have printed tide information that week? Was he planning a fishing trip? A boating excursion? Or something darker? They checked his employment history. He had once volunteered as a special constable in the late 1990s. Not long enough to retain insider status, but long enough to understand investigative procedures. Long enough to appreciate the significance of tide timing in coastal crimes. The possibility that the killer had lived openly among them for years, attending town festivals, shaking hands with grieving parents, was almost too much to absorb. Yet without living suspect, the trail risked going cold again. Then the third blow landed. A woman came forward after seeing the renewed coverage. She had been in a brief relationship with the businessman in 2004. She described him as charming, attentive, and obsessed with the sea. He spoke often about how the tide could erase mistakes. She had dismissed it as poetic. Now it sounded like something else. She remembered an argument the night of the murder. He had left abruptly, returned late, clothes damp. He claimed he'd gone for a solitary walk along the beach to clear his head. She hadn't questioned it. Her testimony electrified the investigation. But with the suspect dead, prosecution was impossible. The case shifted from solving to proving. Could they build enough to declare responsibility publicly? Could they give the family certainty without a courtroom? Forensic teams exhumed archived evidence, searching for any trace DNA that modern methods might detect. The results were inconclusive. Time had degraded too much. The sea had taken its toll. The letter still loomed. If the businessman was the killer, who sent the note? A relative protecting his legacy? An accomplice? Or someone else entirely, relishing the chaos? Weeks passed. The town lived in suspended breath. Every news bulletin felt like a drumbeat. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, silence returned. No second letter. No confession. No definitive forensic breakthrough. Investigators prepared a report outlining the new findings, the revised timeline, the likely suspect. It stopped short of absolute certainty. Words like probable and consistent with filled the pages. It was the closest they had come in 20 years. Yet it still fell short of the finality everyone craved. On a cold evening, beneath a sky the color of slate, the victim's family stood once more by the sea. The tide crept in, indifferent, unstoppable. They listened as Hale explained the developments, the evidence, the likelihood. Not justice. Not trial. But an answer shaped by reason and probability. The mother closed her eyes as waves swallowed the shore. So he walked free, she whispered. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he carried the weight alone until his final breath. Perhaps the staircase fall was not entirely accidental. Or perhaps that is the town's need for symmetry speaking. The letter remains in evidence, sealed in plastic, its ink as sharp as the day it arrived. It is both a clue and a question mark. A reminder that someone out there knows the full truth, whether from guilt, from complicity, or from a vantage point we still cannot see. And as night settles over the promenade, as the pier lights flicker against the dark water, the sea continues its endless rhythm. Rising. Falling. Erasing. Keeping secrets in its cold, shifting depths, where time blurs and certainty drowns, and the echo of one violent night in 2004 still whispers through the wind, refusing to be silenced. The sea did not care about probabilities. It did not care about carefully worded reports, or press conferences measured in legal caution. It rolled in under a bruised sky, just as it had in 2004, just as it had on the night a life ended on wet shingle and the town learned a new vocabulary, blunt force trauma, tidal window, person of interest. Now it learned another phrase, likely responsible. Not charged. Not convicted. Likely. The word hung in the air like fog, thick, unsatisfying, impossible to grasp. When the police announced that the deceased businessman was the primary suspect, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Shock rippled through the community. He had sponsored school events, donated to lifeboat charities, shaken hands at Christmas markets along the promenade. His framed photograph still hung in a cafe near the pier, a smiling benefactor remembered fondly. Within hours, that photograph was taken down. News vans lined the seafront again. Headlines screamed, "Seaside murder linked to local philanthropist. Cold case breakthrough after 20 years. Killer hiding in plain sight." The town felt exposed, as if its cobbled streets and painted beach huts were suddenly part of a crime exhibit. But inside the investigation room, there was no triumph. Only tension. Because the more they examined the businessman's past, the more uneven the ground became. His financial records from 2004 revealed nothing overtly suspicious. No large cash withdrawals. No sudden disappearances. But a forensic accountant noticed something subtle, a pattern of small, regular payments to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. The contract had ended in late 2005, 1 year after the murder. The facility had since changed ownership twice. Records were incomplete. But the unit number was still traceable. Detectives obtained a warrant. The storage facility stood near an industrial estate, its metal doors weathered by salt air and time. When they rolled up the door to the old unit, long emptied, according to paperwork, they found dust, cobwebs, and silence. Nothing obvious. But the concrete floor bore faint discolorations, circular marks as if something heavy had once rested there for a long time. They scraped samples. Sent them to the lab. Days later, the results came back. Trace amounts of oxidized iron consistent with prolonged exposure to seawater. Not definitive. Not proof of anything criminal. But unusual for a storage unit miles from the shore. What had he kept there? A boat? Equipment? Or something far darker? The tide chart found in his loft took on new weight. So did the former girlfriend's statement about damp clothes and late-night walks. And yet, the letter still lingered like a shadow over every theory. You were right about the tide. You were wrong about the time. If the businessman had studied tide patterns, if he had planned the timing carefully, then what was wrong about the time? Had investigators misjudged not only the waterline, but the hour of death itself? Was the attack earlier than anyone believed? Or later? The forensic team revisited the autopsy report from 2004. Technology had advanced. Estimations once considered precise were now seen as broad approximations. Body temperature readings, stomach contents, insect activity, all recalculated using modern models. The revised estimate shifted the window of death by nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes that placed the victim alive at a time when multiple witnesses claimed to see nothing unusual on the beach. Which meant one of two things. Either the witnesses were mistaken, or someone else was present, unseen, unaccounted for. Investigators canvassed the old case files again, this time focusing on a detail once dismissed as trivial, a second set of partial footprints found further up the shore, leading toward the promenade, but fading before reaching solid ground. At the time, they were attributed to a passerby from earlier that evening. The tide had blurred their edges. But what if they belonged to someone who met the killer after the act? The possibility of an accomplice shifted everything. The businessman had business partners, employees, friends. One name began to surface repeatedly in archived correspondence, a longtime associate who had managed several of his properties in the early 2000s. This associate had moved abroad in 2006, relocating to a small coastal town in southern Europe. No criminal record. No history of violence. But a sudden move shortly after the murder. Police initiated contact through international channels. The man agreed to speak voluntarily via video interview. He appeared calm, composed, slightly irritated by the intrusion into a life he claimed to have rebuilt. He admitted knowing the businessman well. Admitted they often discussed maritime schedules because of commercial shipping interests. Denied any involvement in the murder. Denied being near the beach that night. When asked about the storage unit, he paused. Just for a second. Then shrugged. He stored old office furniture, he said. Nothing more. The pause was noted. Meanwhile, forensic linguists examined the anonymous letter. The phrasing was deliberate. The structure precise. You were right about the tide. You were wrong about the time. The repetition suggested someone accustomed to crafting persuasive statements. Someone educated. Possibly male. Possibly older. It was not the language of a reckless taunt. It was controlled. Calculated. Handwriting comparison with archived business documents from the deceased suspect yielded no match. Nor did it match the associate's known samples. But block capitals can conceal identity easily. Public pressure intensified. Some residents demanded the case be officially closed, the businessman named unequivocally as the killer. Others warned against defaming the dead without absolute proof. His family issued a statement expressing profound shock and condemning what they called speculative harm. Through it all, the victim's family waited. They had endured 2 decades of uncertainty. Now they were offered something close to an answer, but not the kind that comes with a courtroom verdict, not the kind that ends with a sentence handed down under fluorescent lights. They were offered likelihood, patterns, circumstantial gravity. And then the investigation took another turn. A retired postman contacted police after recognizing the handwriting style described in media reports. He had delivered mail to the businessman's office for years. He recalled that the businessman often wrote notes in block capitals when labeling packages. It had struck him as distinctive, precise, evenly spaced. Detectives compared spacing patterns between the letter and archived labels recovered from old business files. The similarities were subtle but measurable. Letter height ratios. Consistent slant in the crossbar of the T. Statistical analysis suggested a moderate probability of common authorship. But the suspect was dead. Which raised a new, chilling possibility. What if the letter had been written years earlier, and only mailed recently by someone who found it among his belongings? If so, who? Attention turned to his estate executor, a distant cousin who had overseen his affairs after his death. She insisted she had found nothing unusual. But when pressed about boxes of personal documents, she admitted discarding several sealed envelopes without opening them, assuming they were outdated correspondence. Discarded where? At a landfill site long since processed. The timeline tightened again, suffocating in its own complexity. And then, quietly, almost unnoticed at first, a forensic breakthrough emerged from an unrelated review. In 2004, a cigarette, but had been collected near the scene, but deemed irrelevant, because it lay outside the immediate perimeter. It had never been tested. Advances in DNA amplification now made even degraded samples viable. The lab worked in silence. Weeks passed. When the results arrived, they did not match the deceased businessman. They matched a partial profile from a national database, someone arrested for a minor assault in 2010 in a neighboring county. A living suspect. The name sent a tremor through the task force. He had been 22 in 2004. A seasonal worker at a seaside amusement arcade. No known connection to the victim. No public link to the businessman. But phone records from 2004, recently reconstructed through archived billing data, reveal something astonishing: multiple calls between the arcade worker and the businessman in the weeks leading up to the murder. The narrative shifted violently. Had the businessman hired him? Manipulated him? Or was the businessman a red herring, his proximity mere coincidence? Police moved swiftly. The former arcade worker, now in his 40s, employed as a delivery driver, was brought in for questioning. He denied knowing the victim. Admitted knowing the businessman socially. Claimed the calls concerned casual work opportunities. When confronted with the DNA match to the cigarette, but his composure fractured. He insisted he had been on the beach that night, but only drinking with friends. He said he left before midnight. He said he saw nothing. The revised time of death placed him there at the critical window. The interrogation room felt smaller with each answer. Did he act alone? Did someone older, wealthier, more calculating orchestrate events? Was the businessman the mastermind, the young worker the instrument? Or had investigators constructed a web of connections out of desperation? Outside, the tide crept in again. The town watched from behind curtains and phone screens. The pier lights flickered against dark water. 20 years of whispers condensed into one burning question: was this finally the truth, or just another layer of shadow? Inside the station, detectives prepared for the possibility that the case they thought was nearing resolution had only just exposed its deepest fault line. And as the suspect sat beneath the sterile glow of interrogation lights, his reflection trembling in the mirrored glass, the sea beyond the promenade moved in its endless rhythm, rising, falling, carrying secrets forward, dragging others back, refusing still to surrender the whole story of what happened on that cold night in 2004.